given up on Kenya. But I think this finance bill was kind of like a trigger and a step too far. But in terms of why it is that the organization has happened like this, um, the success, etc., it's really a story of the legacy of protest, the fights that we fought, some lost, some won, to get to the point where we have laws that represent our aspirations. What now hasn't happened is that we don't have leadership, right? At least this is what the protesters are saying. We don't have leadership that conforms to those aspirations. And not only are they doing that, are they not conforming to those aspirations, they, in many ways, are architects of the potential downfall of the country in a few years, directly impacting the lives of Kenyans across the country. So that's kind of where we are, Solo.
All right, thanks a lot. I'll come back to you. Someone just said here, Solomon, opportunity politicians took advantage and also rode on the protests. Dr. Miguna used X to analyze complex hidden implications. We'll get to that, John, but thanks. Stay with me. Today, there was a demonstration in Lusaka, Zambia. As young activists went on the streets, they were all arrested. There will be a demonstration tomorrow on the 11th and the 12th of in Zimbabwe, and of course on the 23rd in Uganda, in Kampala. Perhaps let me bring in Hopewell. Hopewell, let me bring you in here. Tomorrow, young people and people from Zimbabwe will be going to the streets. What lessons do you draw from what has been happening in Kenya as the country organizes for these demonstrations and protests? Hopewell, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Solomon, for having me. It's great to be here. I see some great names, people that I admire, like Dr. Stella Nyanzi, who are also here. We've been learning from them for years. I think the difference that we have, it relates to the evolution of our politics in East Africa and in Southern Africa. Uh, in Zimbabwe, we are where you were with Daniel Arap Moi in East Africa around the 90s. Draconian rules, draconian laws, abuse of state power, rampant corruption, the killing of political opponents, the capture of the judiciary, the capture of the police service, and how the whole nation is cowed into fear and are afraid to go out and exercise their rights. So, for instance, we have Section 59 of the Constitution, which says that citizens can go out to protest peacefully and to petition the government. The ZANU PF government, especially under Emerson Mnangagwa, is not counted as that. They've refused to accept that. When people tried to demonstrate in 2018 on the 1st of August, after our election, the first election after the removal of Robert Mugabe through the military coup, about 6 Zimbabweans were killed with live ammunition. I know that a lot of Zimbabweans from that time, they became so terrified of going into the streets. And each time when somebody talks about demonstrating and reminds everybody that this is a constitutional right, they are reminded of what happened. I'm not so sure about how the Kenyans have dealt with what I'm about to say now. In Zimbabwe, it has been made worse because there are certain elements within the opposition that have been captured by the regime in Harare. There are people in the media supposedly independent, but they are captured. There are subtle messages that are sent out there that you will be killed if you go onto the streets. There are people who deliberately go out there, misinform the public, and instill these messages of fear into the hearts of people to say you can't do this. And when we looked at what happened in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, demonstrations were the preserve of political parties going back, I think, the past 24 years. It was the president of political parties, the opposition going into the streets under Morgan Tsvangirai. When Morgan Tsvangirai died, that culture also died. The current main opposition leader said he doesn't want to go into the streets. He will get people killed. And so when people saw what happened in Kenya, a lot of Zimbabweans thought this was a refreshing way of doing things where you don't have to rely on political parties. You don't have to rely on politicians because they cut deals. They are corrupt both in the opposition and in the ruling party. They are more interested in their own power. They are more interested in staying in power. And those in the opposition are more interested in having a foothold on the feeding. So the Kenyan model, I think, is going to be very attractive to a lot of young people. My good friend Alan Namu mentioned that the median age, I think, is 19 or 20 in Kenya. The median age in Zimbabwe is 17 years old. So we have a very young population who are restive. 95% of our uh, potential workforce is at home. Hospitals do not work. Corruption, the same things that triggered the demonstrations in Kenya are there in abundance in Zimbabwe and more than Kenya. Taxes are just put up every day. It's so ridiculous to a point where even blind people are taxed to go and buy whatever material, braille material that they need. People that have got problems with their eyesight, like myself, if I were buying my glasses in Zimbabwe, I would be taxed. And you expect the government to understand that these things are important for blind people to have. It's important for blind people to have braille material, but these are text. And I think when I look at Kenya, I think the Kenyan society has evolved since the days of Moi. They are no longer scared of the political elites the way that Zimbabweans are terrified of ZANU PF. They are terrified of the military and the police. Recently, we had a general who came out, who's the commander of our army, saying that elections in Zimbabwe, they will use command voting, which means they will tell you who to vote for. So and there was no reaction from the political leaders in Zimbabwe, in the opposition. Today, I was talking to an African leader in East Africa who was asking me where civil society is in Zimbabwe. There was an element of civil society that we saw in Kenya. The Law Society president was active on social media, explaining to people issues, explaining the law, explaining that the police, what they're doing is not right. In Zimbabwe, we don't have that. The Law Society was captured a long time ago. From time to time, we've had people running the Law Society who are loyal to the current president. And so it's impossible to have civil society which is effective as we saw in Kenya. It's impossible to have that in Zimbabwe because civil society has died in Zimbabwe. And I think the other problem that we've had in Zimbabwe is that in the past there's been a lot of support from other countries. But I'll give you a good example of how things went south for civil society, even in terms of funding. Um, when Brexit happened, British government changed its priorities. So civil society movements that were funded by Western countries, um, they stopped having that kind of funding because the world is changing. The West is interested in seeing how to counter the emergence of a Chinese superpower. So they are willing to cut deals with corrupt officials in African countries across the continent. So I think what it did, the Kenyan protest, they inspired Zimbabweans. I see certain people that were not talking about protests now talking about protests. I see certain leaders that would not have gone onto the streets now talking about going to the streets. I see certain professions, especially the media and the legal professions. I see a lot of discussions in WhatsApp groups about what happened in Kenya. Some people are actually ashamed that they belong to professions that are supposed to be at the forefront of of making sure that Zimbabweans are able to exercise their rights, which include Section 59, protesting against the government, petitioning your government. But in Zimbabwe, it's at the moment. We have got 79 people that were arrested the 16th of June. They were celebrating the Youth Day, the 1976 Youth Day in South Africa, where students were killed demonstrating against the compulsory usage of Afrikaans as a language. Um, One of the guys who was arrested with he's the owner of the place where these people were arrested. He's a former government minister. He has been in jail without bail, denied bail for almost a month now. And those are instruments used to instill fear in citizens. And when I looked at the Kenyan side, I realized that our Kenyan brothers and sisters have sort of breached that line of fear. Perhaps because this time it's not the politicians. I looked at Baba and what he's trying to do, his handshakes and all that. And the youths are saying it's not going to work this time. We're not doing it for you, we're doing it for ourselves. So I hope that this is a new spirit that will help Africans to fight against corruption. Corruption is endemic in Zimbabwe. But when you look at how it can be tackled, there's no other way now left except protests. Why I say so is because voting has failed. The elections are rigged. Even SADC, for the first time, said elections have been rigged, but nothing changes. So the only option now left for Zimbabweans, especially the young people who are jobless, who do not have access to healthcare, who do not have clean drinking water in their homes, is to go onto the streets. But let me just take you back to some of our historical, I would say, matches in terms of protests. So in the 1980s, uh, 10 to 20,000 Zimbabweans were killed, and that has trauma. That trauma is still living with those people. They are scared. If you look at Kenya, people were being killed. Government ministers were being killed in Kenya under Daniel Arap Moi. People were being sent to jail. Some had to run out of the country. If you look at countries like Uganda, people like Dr. Stella Nyanzi have been to prison. She's had to run out of Uganda for her own safety and that of her family. So dictators at this point in time, they are really worried about what's going to happen to the Kenyan thing. I know in this particular space, there are a lot of Secret Service people from the Zimbabwean CIO listening, waiting for me to say something. And the next thing I'll hear, knock on my door, you are inciting citizens to protest, you go to prison. I've been to prison 3 times on false charges of incitement. They said I wanted to remove the government of the day. They said I wanted to incite people. I wanted people to be violent and remove the president violently. It's the same card that has been used across the continent, but it's now up to the young people of this continent to realize that change lies in their hands.
All right, thanks. Hopefully, I'm really sorry about what you've been going through in your work as a journalist. I mean, I've followed you quite closely. And speaking of that, young people in Zimbabwe will be demonstrating tomorrow. I think that's going on around in Harare, and they're going to be demonstrating, they say, against corruption, nepotism, poverty, and open repression. That's and someone just tweeted that they need ambulances and lawyers on standby in Zimbabwe tomorrow before arrest. Nicholas Opio is a human rights lawyer who has been observing different issues across the continent and also here in East Africa. Nick, the Kenyans, what do we learn from the Kenyan protests?
Well, first of all, thank you to the first two speakers. I think that Ugandans, in particular, and I think many African youth, are inspired by what they see in Kenya. Um, if you read African protest histories, in the last 2 decades, you can say this is the third round of mass protests against autocratic leaders, starting with what was called the Arab Spring, that led to the fall of autocrats, largely in the Arab region, beginning from Ben Ali in Tunisia, down to Egypt, and in parts of North Africa. That in the last 2 decades was a major wave of protests. The second wave of protests are the ones that saw the fall of the Mugabes, that saw the fall of Omar al-Bashir, that was led really likely by the rise in new media, the role of civil society. In my view, from where I sit, I see a third wave that is generational.
Um,
Can you hear me?
John, can you hear Nicholas?
Yes, I can. I can.
Can I carry on?
Sorry?
Yes,
I
we
can
can
hear.
hear you.
Okay.
Fantastic. So I see this as a third wave of protest that is going to sweep across the continent, thanks to the events in Kenya. And these protests are slightly different in the sense that it appears to me to be generational. It is not conventional protests organized by civil society, organized by parties. Rather, this seems to be
Huh?
young people leveraging on first numbers, but also secondly on technology. And I see this inspiring protest across the continent. Uganda is planning one, as you said, tomorrow Zimbabwe has one. And so the first thing is that the Kenyan protests have emboldened people, and I think the response of the Kenyan government, in part, was responsible for that, because very rarely do you see African leaders folding to demands of citizens. The Kenyan president has walked back a lot of things, partly, I think, to save his skin, because he's seen the determination of the young people in Kenya. And so I see this sweeping across the continent eventually, majorly led by young people. But there's a second element to this, and you've got to distinguish between why the Kenyan protests have been largely successful as they can be, to the extent of forcing the hands of the heads of state. First is that this kind of protests tend to succeed in countries where there are no military leaders in charge of the country. Where there's a military leader in charge of the country, those people are always willing to kill their own citizens to keep themselves in power. I think largely Zimbabwe was also lucky in the Mugabe era. Mugabe wasn't a soldier, an ideologue, an African Pan-Africanist liberator. But in countries like Uganda, where the leader, first before becoming a politician, is a soldier, he will kill without blinking. There have been several episodes on the Ugandan streets where the protesting their government. Those in Uganda know about the 2009 Buganda protests. Others have called them riots, but many people think they were really just an uprising, was a protest. Peaceful, beginning from Kampala and spreading across central Uganda. Hundreds of lives were lost at the hands of state operatives, sometimes in the full view of the camera. In the last election in Uganda, the state was wasted not 18th and 19th to send soldiers on the streets to kill. And the president admitted to killing people on the streets. His own minister for security, his party functionaries, were not even shy to admit that they were going to kill, and indeed they kill people. So in countries that are led by army men as politicians, protests tend to be very, very quickly squashed. You see how the Arab Spring failed in Egypt. Sudan was, Al Bashir was not a soldier, and so you have all this factor that you must. The second thing, in my view, is the geopolitical importance of the country. Kenya is nearly a regional capital. Kenya is an economic protests tend to thrive, and that is coupled with the political history of the country. Uganda, Uganda's history, protests are seen as uprisings. At least in Kenya, you can tell by how people were responding to protests from the post-Moi era. Protests have become some sort of a subculture in the Kenyan community. And so protests thrive in those conditions, broadly speaking. But there's a third thing that I see that the Kenyan protest will teach us.
and see indeed how it will pan out, and whether President Ruto will remain true to his word. I know that over the weekend there was a ceremony to remember those that lost their lives during the protests and during riots. Robert Chirenga, it's good to have you. Robert is the executive director of the National Coalition for Human Rights Defenders. Thanks for joining us, Robert. The conversation in the room is, what lessons do we learn from protests in Kenya? But also, where should protests start and stop? The right to protest, where does it start and stop? All right, over.
Thank you, Solomon. I don't think I need to apologize because I've been on since from the start. I think you just didn't notice it. Thank you, Nicholas, for alerting him. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Good. I think the right to peaceful protest, or right to what we would rather call the right to peaceful assembly, is guaranteed on our legal regime, including the international regimes that we have ratified. And therefore, there is no excuse as to why Ugandans should not be able to exercise this right to peaceful protest. It's provided for under Article 21 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Uganda ratified. It's also provided for in the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda under Article 23, 1D. So we have all that provided in the laws. What I want to agree with is what my colleague Nicholas talked about. The kind of context or the regime that we have here, whether or not it accommodates citizens who intend or wish to exercise their right to peaceful assembly or protest. And of course, basing on what we are seeing and what we've been observing in terms of the institutional capture or decay, whether they are public institutions or civil society, and also looking at the levels of civic competence. I've been arguing with colleagues, you can't compare ourselves with Kenya. Even right from the time of fighting for independence, the struggle they went through to attain their independence cannot be compared to ours. No, the levels are completely different. And then we have a culture now. Sometimes I believe that these governance issues that we're trying to protest against, perhaps it looks like we are beneficiaries is indirectly, whether we benefit, because we are now good at lamenting as opposed to holding these leaders or our managers accountable. We are good at lamenting, but I also have some other pedestal argument, which I've always said, that the presence of food in this country, I think, makes us very comfortable. In Kenya, not more than 40% are able to afford 3 meals a day. In this country, food is available. Even to those who don't work, who have no jobs, who have no employment, they don't sleep an empty stomach. So every decision that they make that will have an impact on his or her livelihood here is not really felt like in the countries like Kenya. So we have a big challenge. But the hope that I have is the demographics that we are seeing, that currently young people are in charge of this society in terms of numbers. And these numbers continue to grow. And if there is no arrangement to keep them busy, to ensure that they're busy, then we are going to follow the Kenyan way. But it will take, for one to go to heaven, you really have to die. There are some who will have to sacrifice themselves. This struggle, as I told my colleagues in the Kenya National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders, that you need to recognize those young men and women who died in that struggle. Because hadn't they to die, maybe the system in Kenya would not have sat down and said, let's talk. So the challenge we have really here is the levels of civic competence. And we really need to see how we can empower young people to take charge of their future and instead empower them to know their rights, demand them, and defend them. Because these are human entitlements by virtue of the fact that you're a human being. These are entitlements. So you have the right to protest if you feel that something is not going well, because it's a very foundation of a system of participatory governance based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law and pluralism. So it also protects the ability of people to exercise your individual autonomy if you feel you are aggrieved, in solidarity with any other person who feels aggrieved. So come 23rd, we would want to see who are those who feel they are aggrieved as a result of this corruption, the malfeasance that is happening in these institutions, such as like Parliament. So we'll need to learn a lot from Kenya. And I know the system here must be watching. I've heard the executive has already warned anyone who attempts to do it. But depending on numbers, there's a limit as to how much the law enforcement can do with numbers. You saw young people in Kenya go into the institutions of State House, and they shot and they kept on taking cover and moving forward. Numbers matter. So the level of mobilization, the level of civic competence is very key in as far as how we can draw lessons from Kenya. And of course, our institutions, the kind of people that occupy these offices and the way that they have been appointed is also wanting. If in Kenya you saw that the army was very reluctant. It took the institution of Parliament to invite the army to go on the street and to protect, not to kill citizens. In our case, the military police, I think, would be the first to make the shots. And I'm not sure whether we are courageous enough or we have the numbers really that will caused them to withdraw back to Makinde barracks? Thank you.
Uh, I know, because we've seen that happen in the past. We've seen that happen in the past in this country. If you've just joined us, we are having a continental conversation on the right to protest, and we're learning some lessons from Kenya. It's your time to talk back. It's your time to make a contribution. It's your time to give us your thoughts and views. What lessons do we learn from Kenya all across Africa? I'll give you an opportunity to share. And once I give you the mic, you can indeed at least take at least 3 minutes, 2 minutes, so that we can have different speakers join, and yeah, all of us, we can share our thoughts. Let me start with Mr. Daniel. Mr. Daniel Wabwire, you're welcome.
Uh, Here in Kenya, I can say good evening. Yeah,
Good evening.
yeah. I have some submission that I have to make concerning the topic. I think the main agenda that brought us together as Gen Zs, Millennia, Gen X was about our movement was tribalist, where no leader could use that as a weapon to incite community against another, and that one played a very big part on our success. It was not about carrying on mobilization. We came together for the same purpose, which is affecting everybody. Financial bill was just a catalyst, and that is the reason why we are still on the struggle, because there are a lot of things that need to be looked into. Issue like corruption, issue like unemployment, and tribal lines. That is what we are trying to sort out. What I will encourage my fellow countrymen, neighbors from Uganda and all over the world is that when you stand together, you can overcome any dictator in the world. They say when we have power, when we don't fear anything, this dictator thrives on fear. When you are fear, if you are fear, if you anything that they say, you bend on their command, they will take that advantage. They will continue to mismanage, to doing that deals, that businesses, and to continue manipulating everybody. I just want to thank the effort that activists are making in Uganda, in other parts of Zimbabwe, and even in Nigeria, coming together to fight for your right. In Kenya, it is outlined in our constitution. Everybody should look at their rule of law and practice accordingly. Human rights, even journalists, everybody come together and you fight the same cause. That is just my
All
small
right.
submission.
All right. Thanks, Daniel Wabwire, there speaking to us from Kenya. Thank you very much. Horoso, you're welcome. Hosoro. Hosoro, are you there? All right. Let me bring in Stella.
Oh,
Ah, you're here. Okay. Yes, you have a minute or two to make your submission.
uh, just wanted to say that, yeah, Kenya youth uh, generations are usually different for thousands of years. The younger generation always blames the and older generation always thinks the younger generations are weak, right? So, but recently with the social media that's happening, we usually have been having changes in the generations. with silo effect. But now, because of social media, they're all changing at the same time, right? Not according to their cultures. So all the new youth, right, in Africa, from what happened in Kenya, and I think what made it successful is because they were not led by a politician, right? It was organic. I'll give an example of if a man is married, right, and he knows there's a wife, there's another man that likes his wife or he's been going after his wife, and that man comes and says, "Oh, your wife, Siesta, doesn't look good. You gotta change it." Even if you know it's not good, you're gonna fight, right, not to change it. So symbolism matters a lot. If opposition leads a protest, the incumbent is gonna fight a lot, right? They're gonna kill people because symbolically, if an opposition leader wins the protest, it means they have taken power. That's all I'm gonna say. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Thank you. And I think someone else mentioned that this was organic. This was not political. It was tribeless. It was just the people rising up against what they felt was oppressing them. Hosoro, thank you. Cynthia, Cynthia, you're welcome.
Thank you, Solomon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Thanks for having me. Well, I've been listening in, and I've had the contributions of previous speakers, especially when it comes to the dangers involved in participating in protests in Uganda. And I have to acknowledge and recognize that participating in protests in Uganda carries inherent risks, and anyone attending the 23rd July peaceful protest to Parliament must be prepared to accept these dangers. Nevertheless, we emphasize that this will be a peaceful protest, and we urge the men and women in uniform to acknowledge this and fulfill their duty to protect the interests of all Ugandans on that day. Definitely, we hope to notify the police and cooperate with the police, and we hope that the police will maintain peace. And I'm being very optimistic right now, but we can only hope for the best, because we know obviously Uganda's political landscape differs from Kenyan's more progressive democracy. But definitely the demand to end corruption is inevitable, and we've had different actors in Uganda politics that have contributed hugely to making us aware of the necessity and urgency that is required for Ugandan citizens to stand up and take action against corruption, as our leaders have failed us in this area. And for the success of this protest, we only hope that Ugandans will unite, and we also hope for a positive response from the government, because usually we know the government usually retaliates in a violent and brutal manner. Just at just has just yes. So as Ugandans, we will be marching against corruption on that day, and we appeal to the humanity of the Uganda police force to acknowledge that corruption affects them too, not just us.
All right.
Yes,
All
Nicholas.
right. Thank.
Before yes, I still have a few things to add.
Okay, just add it, just a minute, and then I can bring in other people.
Okay, yes. Yes. Nicholas earlier said that the Kenyans had a specific demand, and our demand in Uganda is also very simple. We all know that corruption is taking place, and we only want an end to corruption. Yes, and that's all. And I hope this is a reason that resonates with mostly all Ugandans. That's all. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Cynthia, for your submissions. Charles Ogira, Charles
Yeah.
Donaldson Ogira.
Yes, thank you so much, Solomon, and all the listeners. First and foremost, I must say that the protest in Kenya has really set a new trend for all the youth across several divides in across East Africa and of course beyond. But my fear is that one, we are operating in a military regime that from our inception to power or to government, they held a gun on anything that would deter them from capturing power. And the surge, the LRS surge in northern Uganda, redirected the democratic trends of Uganda in a manner that it is subjected people into complete state of desolation, fear, and apathy. And it groomed in us, where we can't even question certain actions of our own parents if we know that what they do to us is wrong. Instead, we have to obey. We have to commit to whatsoever thing that they tell us. Also, the civil society network in Kenya is a very strong one. They have a very strong cobweb network that working hand in hand with the civilians, with the people to ensure that they challenge the democratic, the constitutional issues in their countries, the human rights violations in their countries. And it is not the case in Uganda. Much as civil society have tried, I would arguably say it is probable that some civil society organizations are in bed with the state because they have failed to speak up on the critical issues that affect the people. We have failed to see civil society leaders come and say, let us be the ones to hold the placards and front ourselves to parliament. We instead want to, mobilize people to come together for the usual workshops, capacity building and trainings, but we have failed as civil society network to put into tangible and workable approaches that vividly make us come at the forefront. And so the rest of the civilians or the protesters who do not have a backing to follow us. If we are to come first, then the rest of the civilians in every other pockets of the country will say yes. The fact that we have the civil society organizations coming first, telling us, let's do this, they've trained us, yes, they've empowered us, let's do this all together, it will work. But it's a situation where Karamoja is facing its own problem. No, Gulu or northern Uganda, say later, Gulu facing their own problem. To Tororo, I mean, we have our unique challenges, which are state managed to, position us in a situation that we can never raise our head or our hands beyond what we feel we should condemn. And we have failed to identify a common advocacy issue that we should front as a people, say to parliament. The very last one is, of course, the arms of government. They are not working hand in hand. You find that the executive has cordoned the parliament, of course, the policymakers, and the judiciary is also acting in line with what these people expect them to do, the military regime, of course. So it make us somehow fail to achieve what we want as a country until we are able to redraw our paths, become intentional, get angry enough like we have never before. We may not achieve what we desire as a country. Thank you so much, but I appreciate you for all the time putting into measures that can make us speak up as a people. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks a lot. Charles Ogira, thank you. Charles is a human rights defender and also a lawyer. Thanks a lot. Let me bring in Mr. Tumwesije. Mr. Tumwesije Humphrey, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Solomon. Always a pleasure being with you on this space, and I hope we learn 2 or 3 things from this. Solomon, you are telling us the right protests, and you are asking us the lessons we learn from Kenya. Now, Solomon, when you look at the 2010 Kenyan Constitution, you look at the 1995 Ugandan Constitution, you realize that we all have documents called the Constitution, but the two provide with us different issues. Now, when you look at the 2010 Kenyan Constitution, it gives institutions in Kenya their independence. That's why you find the president of Kenya will go addressing the press and say that he has the most incompetent IGP. Why does he say that? He says that because the IGP is independent from the president. So he knows he has no control over the president. So if you compare with Uganda, what I can say that in Uganda, we were betrayed long time ago in 1995 by the makers of our constitution. You will find that if it's the security, the constitution will tell you that the commander in chief is the president. That means he has control over the army, he has control over the police, he has control over everyone, the all the armed forces. So there is even no a single day where the army commander, the IGP, or the commissioner of prisons can take an independent decision not to send the army to the streets. Now, when you come to Uganda, what is that common cause that we are looking at? The Kenyans had a law that was affecting all of them, and they decided to come together. But in Uganda, as people are saying on 23rd, we are all coming to go to parliament. Do you know that there are some people who have benefited as a result of that corruption, and they will not even get bothered to go to parliament because to them they have benefited from that corruption. Now, when you look at our own Uganda UCC here, do you think the MD of UCC will even take a minute not to switch on that internet? Because his allegiance is where? His allegiance is to the executive. So, whereas we must learn from the Kenyan protests, we must appreciate which landscape or which country are we in. I appreciate my brother Nicholas Opio what he said at the start that when you're under the rule of military man, the military man will not hesitate to shoot to kill in a minute. So we must also understand that when Ruto came in as the president of Kenya, Ruto came in with this new constitution of Kenya, and Ruto is a civilian. So you cannot look at a civilian president the same way you look at a military president. So as Ugandans prepare for 23rd to go to parliament, we must understand that we are dealing with a government that is military. We are dealing with a government that will not hesitate to shoot and kill you. We are dealing with police that is itself disgruntled. They will get their anger and put it on the citizens. So before we make any attempts to march to parliament, we must appreciate the Ugandan that we are in because we were betrayed by our people in 1995 who decided to get all the powers under the constitution and give it to the president. The chief justice cannot even stand and make a decision on his own. The president is now acting as a state of execution. There will be a court order. The president will call the chief justice and tell him, please overturn this decision.
As you conclude.
Yes, as I conclude, I saw a tweet from the Speaker of Parliament saying that she has always been a person who listens and wants to engage with people. If she really means what she says, let her go on Twitter and say that on 23rd she's willing to meet the protesters and listen to them and talk about this corruption. Let's not have this. Solomon, my conclusion is before as Ugandan, as the youth, as before we protest to parliament, let us understand that our landscape in Uganda is totally different from the Kenyan landscape, and our institutions are not independent as Kenyan institutions. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks a lot for that. Interesting. Your views, your comments, your contributions are appreciated. We have Thamsanga. You're very welcome, Thamsanga.
Thank you so much, my brother. I don't usually speak on these forums, but I just thought that it is important to provide some balance, probably what I would call a voice of caution. And I will give you a few examples. Number one, I would like to believe, as I understand, that what you call a success in the protest in Kenya over the finance bill was because President Ruto, my understanding is he conceded and backed down because he wanted to save lives, having learned lessons from 2007, 2008. And at that time, as you would appreciate, he was dragged to The Hague together with former President Uhuru. Those that are in Kenya who'd want to be reminded of the events of 2007 and 2008. So my understanding is that the president conceded because he did not want the situation to deteriorate until things were out of control and lives were being lost. So, but if I give you an example of the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, three countries where demonstrations and protests are held, and the constitutions of these countries are what most of African countries are modeled on when we speak about the right to protest. So you'd realize that in the United Kingdom, millions of people demonstrated against the war in Iraq, but none of them dared to cross the line into the House of Parliament or to Buckingham Palace. Why? Because there are consequences to crossing that line. It's okay if you exercise your right to protest, but there are limits to the right to protest. If you remember, in America, people were marching and protesting over George Floyd and other things. That was fine as long as they were not crossing the line. January the 6th, during the Trump protest, the minute some people crossed that line and stormed the Capitol Hill, the army in America was brought in. Lives were lost. And the same thing happens in France. France, they demonstrate and they protest almost every weekend. They go to designated areas. They don't disturb business. They do it at specific times. They do it within what is allowed by law to make sure that they don't disrupt the lives of others that don't want to be part of those protests. None of those in France would demonstrate thousands and hundreds of thousands almost every week or weekend, should I say, dare to go to the Elysee or cross into parliament. Why? Because the minute you do that, even in France, there are serious consequences when the army is brought in. So I think we need to be very cautious and say the right to protest is within the constitutions of all the African countries. But the minute you cross the line, the minute you try to overthrow a government, there might actually be consequences. And those consequences will be the same whether you're in Kenya, you're in Uganda, you're in America, you are in France, you're in the UK, or any other country that you might think about in the world. So I just thought that let me come in and sound a caution and say, do in Kenya what you do in America. Do in Uganda what you do in the UK. The UK, you would not demonstrate and be allowed to storm Buckingham Palace. Anyone who knows and understands countries and the security of the nations will tell you that that's something that can't be done. So I urge our brothers to be responsible, those that have influence, those that are organizing whatever protests. If you're organizing those protests, don't put other people's children at risk and within your rights, knowing the limits, but know that trying to overthrow a government will come with consequences. And we don't want those consequences to include loss of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have rights to protest, but we must do it within certain confines. Thanks a lot for that. That's interesting. We've also noted that down. Great insights there. Thamsanga, thank you. John, I'll come to you. Agatha Tuhairi, you're welcome, Agatha. Karibu.
Hi, Solomon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yeah.
you loud and
Good
clear.
evening to you and everyone on this space. I think it's a very important space. I think I'll start from what the last speaker said that caught my attention when he talks about crossing the line and consequences. Who determines that line? Because it happens all the time where these authoritarian regimes will claim that people wanted to overthrow a government. It's what happened in Kampala in November 2020, the incident that Nick alluded to. So who decides that a line has been crossed? That's a gray area right there. But I think why I thought I want to say something on this space is that the lessons from Kenya maybe shouldn't be about the right to protest, should be what we as Ugandans can do to rebuild, restore structures and institutions. I think the reason Kenya had successful protests that with minimal damage, I am sure if those happened here, we wouldn't even count the bodies, the dead bodies in Uganda here. So we saw things that for us as Ugandans were very strange. We had never seen that. That the parliament of Kenya refused was first the approval of parliament was first sought to, for example, deploy the army on the streets. I think in Uganda it has become so normal for the army to be everywhere. Uh, Many times where I pass to go to the school of my children and back, there's a roadblock all the time, a military one, and they're always asking, why is the army on the street? They're asking because they're just seeing it. For us, we've seen it so many times that it's now so normal. We don't even ask, we just see them. It's just a military city, a military country. But I had the government of Kenya in parliament seeking this approval. And I said, imagine this is not even the government trying to deploy their army outside their country, but they have to seek approval. And you saw how the court refused at first, and there was this back and forth. That can never happen here. It cannot. The military will be on the streets and will kill at will, like they did, like they have several times. Go to the regulators, the regulatory authority there that refused to shut down the internet. There's no way this can happen here. Look at how the protesters were interacting with the security. Here you're going to get a bullet in your head even without doing anything. The people that were killed on the streets in 2020 included a retiree that was going about his business, Kamiati, who was vending food and all that. So you look at that, you look at how courts in Kenya work, how the parliament in Kenya works, how these other institutions work, and here they don't. So the people that, the protest that is being planned right now, I am sure people are ready to, for whatever comes. I think some of them will first even write their wills or something. I think it's Robert who talked about the sacrifices we should be willing to make. So I hope there are those that are willing to make that sacrifice, because I think things will have to change in this country, and it's just a matter of time that at the end of the day, we will have no choice but to fight back in whatever way we can. I am glad we have seen a bit of progress in that, in people's resolve to push back and demand and ask questions. I'm glad we've had the Kenyans to, look up to and say that there's an example here. But I would like to also tell governments, like how the former speaker came to caution those that want to push back or protest. I would like to also tell governments that it would never have to get to that. When people are talking about issues that are going wrong, we should have governments that listen to that, that should be willing to account. But if they don't, I think it's just a matter of time that people will, feel pushed to the wall. They can't afford life, like Robert Kavshenga once said. Ugandans can't afford life. Kenyans saw that they were reaching a point where they were not going to afford life, and thought that the only option they have is to do what they had to do. So yeah, thank you for this space once again. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Agatha. for that, and as well for holding similar conversations. Much appreciated. I'll give an opportunity to three or four more people, and then I go back to my panelists. Evans, Karibu.
Asante sana Solomon. Very interesting speeches here and deliberations. I've had the privilege to actually visit Uganda. I am Kenyan and I currently live in Finland, so I probably have a wider spectrum of looking at not solely protest, but how progressive societies work and what makes them tick. So, listening to a couple of conversations here, especially I think the speaker before the lady, who talked about the fact that there are certain places that you can't go to, and there are certain institutions that you can't talk about or you can't criticize. If you look at history, if you go down to history, most of these, like for example, European societies, the American societies, there were bloody protests in the 19th century and going up to the earliest 20th century. So we are talking about societies that have matured by bloodletting, that have matured by pouring blood. If you look at the history of Kenya, we are now looking at what is happening now didn't just not come out of the blue. There have been protests. If you remember early 90s when it was a one-party state and when the people were fighting for multipartyism, there was a lot of blood that was poured. If you go way back to Mau Mau, so I would say that right now we are living in different times because of course we have communicate the way we communicate is different. I mean, if it was back in the day, you would hear that there was a protest in Nairobi, maybe after 3 days or something, but now you know that something is happening right now. You are equipped with information. You can get information on a tap. Language is broken down so that so many people can understand how the countries are run and what is not being done right. So to say that some of this protests or the right to protest at what is happening in Kenya now has come as in the recent past weeks would be wrong. This is a culmination of a culture that has been cultivated over time when it comes to protesting. And I think my friend John Allen would back me up to say that a lot of people have died. The reason why it seems that now, because of course young people are being killed, young people are aware of how the country is run. I am a millennial. I'm on the apex of a millennial and a generation X. So we lived in the President Moi era. We were children, and then we transitioned to the Kibaki Uhuru era, and now we are in Ruto's era. So if you look at what has happened over time, is that we have, as Kenyans, we have consistently fought for justice. We have consistently, I mean, the the terrain has not been easy. There's this joke that goes around that a Kenyan can survive anywhere in the world. I mean, Helsinki, it gets to -50 here. But the truth is that this fight is just reaching the apex of it right now. But it has been here before. I was in Uganda. I've been to Uganda maybe 3 times, and I'm a psychologist. So when I go to places, I have a third eye to things and the way I can see things. So I have the Kenyan band, the Kenyan flag in my on my wrist. And the moment I remember I was in a hotel and I had a shirt that was covering it, and the moment I sort of rolled back my shirt and the Ugandan saw my band, the mood changed right away. And later, when I talked to them and asked them what was that about, then it was like the notion is that I could be a spy. So there is something called public psyche control, and a public psyche control is what it's actually a military war. I would call it a war tactic that can be used to control populations. So you can be sold fear that probably doesn't exist. You can be sold fear that a few people will be put down, and then you're told the rest of the population, this is what will happen to you if you do certain things. The things that are happening in Kenya are no more or less than what would happen in Uganda. But what has happened over time in Kenya is that we have consistently educated ourselves and refused to be controlled by the politicians. Of course, it comes with a price. And even the young people, as you say, the lady was saying that if you try to protest now, everybody will be shot. But the politicians cannot kill everybody in the country who will pay the money that they want. So we have had 40 people being killed, 40 young people being killed, as I think those are the tallies as by yesterday. But we've had more people killed. Actually, just this year, when the opposition was fighting for the amendment of the IBC, there were people killed. People were being actually the police were going into people's home and dragging them out and shooting them in front of their families. It's not long ago. It's just that we forget things very fast. But what I wanna say as a Kenyan who lives in the diaspora is that what our young people are saying now in Kenya is that it's no longer the person who is sitting at the top. It's the constitution that is the leader. If you have a good document and the citizens can consistently press the politicians to adhere to the constitution, then that becomes the leader. Because why this protest has been so magnanimous is because there is nobody to negotiate with, there's nobody to blame. There is no one somebody sitting at the top and saying, yes, I am the leader of this protest. People are saying the problems are the instigators and the constitution is the direction. So I am when I'm listening to especially our brothers from across the border speaking, it emanates from years and years of being psychologically controlled and told that if you do this, this will happen. But the power always remains with the people. And if people would rise up, know their rights, step on the streets, and start speaking boldly, nobody can outlive the people, because the people is the movement, and the people are the power. People are the country. So it's not about Kise Besije. I remember him. It's not about, I don't know any other prominent opposition guy in Uganda. I remember only Kisa Besije. But if it is the Ugandan people, eventually the Ugandan people will prevail. Thank you so much, Solomon. Thank you. I yield back.
Asante sana. Tunashukuru. Evans, thank you very much for your submissions. I'll give three more people and then go back to my panelists. I see we have about 10 minutes. Um, Mr. Kwizera Richard. Mr. Richard Kwizera, are you there? Okay. Salani, you're welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Solomon. I really appreciate it. And what a fantastic space. I just wanted to say a couple of things. And I'm from Zimbabwe. So what I'm going to speak to is basically use Zimbabwe as a case study in my submission. I think that will make more sense to even those who'll be listening. So I saw everything that happened in Kenya, and I have to be honest. That was I want to thank the Kenyans for what the efforts they put in. And one thing that resonated that I noticed from them was the fact that when they were dealing with the finance bill, it had to do with them finding common goal. One thing about protests is that it has to be something that unifies us all, a situation where everybody could see themselves in that finance bill. They could see the problems which would cost them and cause when it came to their various situations. And that is what you were playing for us earlier in the space. So from that common issue that they were all now facing, each one of them, wherever they come from, whichever tribe, language you speak, you could see yourself that this was going to be a problem for you as well. Now, in Zimbabwe, we kind of have this a mentality of saying, "Namoye umwe irambirwe sadza." That translates to someone else's problem will not make me not eat food or sadza, so to say. And that's a big problem because that means there's a bit of selfishness in it, that if it does not touch me and my house, then I'm not going to get involved. And this is a problem I've seen regularly when it comes to the way in which Zimbabweans are dealing with these issues, and a lot of them, for that matter of fact. And what the problem you have there now is that if everyone feels that way, we've had doctors who've needed pay rise, we've had teachers who've needed pay rise, they've all held protests. But guess what? They've had little to no people that have supported them. Whether it's fellow Zimbabweans coming in and saying, "Oh yes, if a doctor's not being paid right, that can affect us." No, there's not that kind of thinking to say they need to be paid right so that we can receive the best medical attention we have. And the moment you have that problem where someone thinks of themselves, you will see a situation whereby even if you wanted to call for a protest, who's going to join? Because there's no unity. Unity is the first recipe that you need for any protest to be successful. You need to be united in a cause that you're standing for. And I feel truly, when it comes to my country, we are so lacking in that. And I truly hope that we can work out how we can find each other. Because what the Kenyans showed us was that they are Kenyan first before anything else, right? And this is something I've said to even anyone in any country from Africa. You are from that country first before anything else, before your political jacket, before your profession, before anything. You have to remember what it means to be Zimbabwean, Kenyan, Ugandan, you name it. And then that will give you that unity of purpose for you to come together. Now, another thing that I've also noticed is that people want to follow individuals. It's not about the issue. It's about, okay, there is this problem whereby our healthcare system is not working correctly. They want to wait for someone they see as popular with them, like someone who says the right things. They want to see that individual leading something.